And we're going to talk a little bit more about that this morning in Genesis chapter 17. In Genesis chapter 17, throughout this time, I've been interchangeably using Abram and Abraham because, well, that's what his name is going to become today, and the name that most of us know him as. But up until this point, Abram is the name that his mama gave him. And Abram is 99 years old when God changes his name. 99 years old. I don't think we have anybody that has yet attained to that number in our congregation, have we? Not present with us anyway. 99 years old. By 99 years old, you've pretty well established who you are, haven't you? Most of us are much younger than that and kind of think we have established who we are. When the question comes, who are you, what is your natural response? Well, who are you? But your name, right? If you're a little defensive, it might be, who are you? But what are you asking? When someone asks, who are you, or you ask someone, who are you? The first thing that we give them is a name. Now, we like to put a lot of thought into names, don't we? I remember when we found out we were pregnant with Caleb, first of all, we were so convinced that we would have a girl that we had already settled on a girl's name. And then when we found out he was going to be a boy, we were like, we are absolutely confused. Drove our parents nuts because, everybody wants to monogram things and put their names on stuff. And so it was what's this baby's name going to be? And for me, knowing he's going to be a boy and live with his last name his whole life, I wanted his first name to be something that he didn't have to spell, right? If you have a complicated last name, you understand the problem, right? Sorensen doesn't sound all that complicated, but I've seen it spelled and pronounced in about every way that is possible. And sometimes it looks absolutely nothing like what I said. And the fact that it ends with an S-E-N does not help. Right? My wife used to have a very simple last name, and then she married me, and so now she spells her first and last name, right? So when we named Caleb, it's like, all right, it needs to be short, because Sorensen's kind of lengthy. And I have a lengthy first name and a lengthy last name, and sometimes you don't have enough blanks to fill in stuff on forms. So we were very particular about why we named him what we named him. I've always liked the name Caleb. It just happened to be simple and short, and his middle name is mine, so that was pretty simple. But we put a lot of thought in the names, don't we? Think about when you named your kids. It's usually named, if they're named after a relative, that person means something to you, right? They're close to you, or you just found a name in a baby book and you're like, I love that name. I love what it means, right? Most of you probably can just kind of cite, what does your name mean, right? Mine comes from the Bible. It means gift of God. Sometimes some others said I acted that way. Right? You know what it means. That name means something. So for Abram to have his name changed at 99 years old, something drastic happens. Right? He left behind a whole identity that had defined him for the better part of a century because God gave him a different name. We don't think about that. I mean, God just changes. He does that willy-nilly sometimes. He's just like, your name's going to be so-and-so, right? You get to Jacob. Jacob's name means grabber. And he's like, no. Your name is Israel, one who struggles with God. I'm like, yeah, that defines him pretty well. That name means something. And so if God changes your name, it says something, right? It says something about who he is, that he can change our identity. If you read in the book of Daniel, one of the first things that the Babylonians do when they take Daniel and his friends into captivity is they change their names. And in fact, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the names that we know his three friends by, but that was not the names that their mothers gave them. That was the name that the Babylonians gave them. And there's a reason they changed their names, because all of their Hebrew names referred back to their God. And all their new Babylonian names referred to the different pantheon of gods in Babylon. What you name someone matters. The meaning of that name matters. Our identity is not just in a group of syllables, but in what that group of syllables represents. And so read with me today in Genesis chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. Now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. I have made you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said further to Abraham, Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And every man in this congregation just inwardly groaned. Right? That's awkward. Why? What is this strange symbol that God has for his covenant? Why? All of these great promises. Think about the promises that God has made Abram at this point. Right? He says, I will be a blessing to you. You will be a blessing to the nations. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. You will have this land. You will have descendants. Kings will come from you. I will make a covenant with you. And in the midst of that, he says, this is the sign of the covenant, circumcision. Why? Right? Why? This was not unheard of in the ancient Near East. The Egyptians actually practiced this very early on, and we, by and large, today practice it as a means of health care, right? If you've had a little boy, you know the process. That first couple of weeks of diapers, you just douse them with the cream and make sure that none of that gets hurt, right? Make sure there's no infection. Why? Why do we do that? You ever stop to think about that? Why is this the sign of the covenant? It's kind of strange. Like, can you imagine Abraham at this point, who is 99 years old? And God says, this is going to be the sign of our covenant. I'm going to be honest. At 99 years old, I'm going to like, whoa, time out. What? It's okay to laugh. Like, it is kind of funny. Like, it really is. Hold on. You want us to what? Keep reading. You shall be, verse 11, you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. All right, that makes a little more sense, because that was the covenant at the beginning. It was like, wait, what? But this is the sign, right? An outward symbol of an inward reality. Still kind of strange to the Western ear, isn't it? And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. What is going on? Why? Well, if you think about it, it's a visual reminder to every single male that has ever been born underneath that covenant who they belong to. And when you consider that most of the sin that takes place in our culture is sexual in nature, that reminder of who you belong to and how you ought to act and comport yourself, it's a pretty good reminder. Keep in mind that it is only a chapter removed from where Abraham sinned in his faithlessness towards God by having a child with his wife's servant. I don't think that's a coincidence. There's not a direct link there, but there seems to be a reminder like, no. I've made a covenant with you, and I've promised you a son by your wife. And I think you need to be reminded of that, even if you're 99 years old. And y'all thought God got personal with you in your quiet time this morning. What God is demanding of this covenant is a reminder to every single member of the covenant community that he is the reason God is blessing these people. His faithfulness, not Abraham's, not the people of Israel because they fail, but in his faithfulness, because of his covenant, every single time you have children, particularly male children, this sign is a covenant that you have that child because I have blessed you with him. Isn't that fascinating? It is awkward to the Western ear, and I don't deny that, but think about what it means for Abraham and for every single male descendant after him who wants to be part of God's covenant people, that what it means is a daily reminder that every time you have children, every time that you have descendants, the reason you have them is because I blessed you with them. Man, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. God is all up in our business, and he has every right to be. Every right to be. What he demands of even the smallest details of our life, he has a right to demand that, particularly if we are in covenant with him. And so for Abraham, I'm sure that came off like, whoa, you want me to what? Because understand, in ancient Near Eastern cultures that did practice circumcision, it was a result of, for the man when he hit puberty or when he got married. So it was a coming of age ceremony. But for them, it wasn't something that they earned. It wasn't something that they grew into. For the covenant people of God, this was a ceremony that was performed because you were the covenant people of God, and he had chosen you, not that you had earned anything. And so the covenant of circumcision, I don't want us to be confused about this, is not a covenant of works. You have to be circumcised to be a part of the people of God. That is an element of it. But what God is saying is, I have chosen you, and I have marked you before you could ever do anything to earn my favor. This is salvation by grace through faith. And their circumcision practice is basically our baptism. It's an initiation rite into the covenant people of God, right? It's an outward sign of an inward reality. When we baptize someone, is that not exactly what we say? This is an outward sign. This practice does not save you, but it is a symbol. It is a sign to all who see it that I have died to my old self and been raised to new life, that I am now part of God's covenant people. So this seems strange to us, but what's happening is something that you and I are actually very familiar with. This is an outward symbol that these people are now part of the covenant people of God. Not because of anything they have done, but because of the calling of God on their life and their response of faith. I didn't know you were getting that deep an idea about circumcision this morning, did you? So, there's the covenant of circumcision is an initiation rite to be part of the covenant people of God, an outward symbol of that inward reality that God has called them to himself, and they have responded in faith. But that's not all. Because verse 15 picks up, then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. It's interesting. We need to talk about what these names mean, right? Abram means exalted father. He does at least have one son. But what God changes his name to is Abraham, father of a multitude, or father of many. That's a little different, isn't it? If you wanted to honor your father, good way to do it would be to name yourself Exalted Father. But if you were wanting to talk about the future and God's blessing on you, Father of a multitude has a totally different meaning, doesn't it? Father of a multitude means I identify with the promise that God has made me, that what God has declared about me, I will live into. Think about that. By changing his name, it changes his identity. His name was a reference back to his father. His new name, Abraham, is a name given to him by God in light of the promises of God. His identity is now wrapped up in what God has promised to him. That's important. Sarai means my princess. That's cute. I like that. Sarah takes the my off of that. It's no longer personal. She is, not just is to me, but is princess or queen. The mother of nations, the mother of kings. Again, her name is changed to reflect the promises that God has made and their faith in his promises. Now, ironically, what happens? After all of this, keep in mind, Abraham has said nothing this whole chapter until verse 17. Abraham fell on his face, good response, and laughed. He laughed. That's why I said it's okay to laugh. You know why? Because it's funny. This man is 99 years old and his wife is almost 90. Ladies, if you are under 90 years old in this room, think about how funny it would be for you to say, I'm going to have a baby. It's fun. Yeah, you're okay. It's okay to laugh. It's funny. Abraham laughed because it's funny. Like, this is not how the world works. People get done having their babies now it's like 40. Back then it was like 30. Because people didn't live that long. The idea of a 90-year-old woman giving birth to a son is funny. It's laughable. Like, it's just like, that doesn't even make sense. There's no way. Abraham laughs. At least I don't think he did it out loud, because it says he said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old, and will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? It's funny. God has a sense of humor, though. He actually has the last laugh here, literally. He says, no, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Do you know what Isaac's name means? He laughs. He laughs. In the next couple of chapters, you'll see Sarah. Sarah, when she gets the news that she's going to have a baby at 90 years old, you know what she does? She laughs. Abraham gets the news that he's going to be a dad at 100, and he laughs. Like, there's no way. And God gets the last laugh. He goes, you're going to have one, and his name is going to be, he laughs. Who does he refer to? God. God gave you that son, and you laughed about it. He laughs. He gets the last laugh when Isaac is born. He says, you're going to call that boy, he laughs. Yitzhak, Isaac. He laughs. Why? Because when we don't believe God, when we think that it is impossible for God to do what he has said he's going to do, and we're like, there's no way. Do you know what God does? He laughs. He thinks it's absolutely hilarious that you put a limit on what he can do. He laughs. As for Ishmael, verse 20, because Abraham had said, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. He has a son, right? And however his birth came about, that's his boy. And he's 13 years old. Like, in that culture, he's basically a man. Like, here's Ishmael. Like, why are we starting over when I'm 100? I've got a son. Like, just make him the son of promise. And God says, no. He goes, I hear you, though. I hear you. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. And then you know what happens? I'm just going to save us the time from reading those last few verses, because here's the thing. Abraham takes Ishmael and every member of his household, every servant, every slave, every male that identifies with Abraham is circumcised exactly the way God told him to. Abraham is 99, Ishmael is 13, and they range in his house all the way in between. Every single male. Can you imagine? Because we know he has at least 300 fighting age men that he's able to raise an army when he goes to rescue Lot. Can you imagine when the order comes around for his whole household? Because this is not like there's no delayed reaction here. On the day he receives this word from God, he obeys. And every man in his household goes, are you sure you heard him right? And yet, because of their faith in God, they too follow Abraham's lead. Now, Genesis 17 is just awkward to the Western ear. It just is, because this is not the way you and I understand the world. But I want you to understand what's happening here. God has already made promises. God has already made covenant. Remember chapter 15 when they cut a covenant where they literally like split the animals in two and God walks between it? And he makes binding eternal promises to Abraham. So I need you to understand something. In that moment, what we read is Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. So what's happening here? God has already saved him by grace through faith, like he always does. But here in chapter 17, suddenly there are conditions. But it's not conditions for salvation. It's conditions for being the covenant people of God. It says, if you are who you claim to be, if you are my people, here's what you must do. The very first words out of God's mouth in this section are, I am God Almighty, walk before me. So God calls us to himself. God calls us to himself. Right? We like to talk about God's call to do great things, but the thing God calls us to is him. Right? When I received my call to ministry at 15 years old, there was a lot of talk with the guys I went to school with about the things that God was calling us to do. Because some of us wanted to be great megachurch pastors. And some of us wanted to be great evangelists, be on the world stage. And I look back at those conversations, I'm like, what fools we were. Because God does not call us to things, he calls us to him. God doesn't send us where he is not. Do you hear me? God does not send us where he is not. When he calls us to himself. And so if we're pursuing things and not him, I can guarantee you are not pursuing the call of God. If you are pursuing things and not Jesus, you are not pursuing the things of God. Is that simple enough? Because I want you to hear that. When we pursue things, even if they're good things, if the goal is the thing, you failed. If the goal is the thing, we fail. The goal is follow God. he calls us to himself. Now, when he calls us to himself, he also calls us to live for his glory, because the very next thing he says, walk before me and be blameless. Be blameless. Now, that's different. That's not be perfect, right? Because we know we can't do that. In fact, when Jesus is called good teacher, he says, whoa, I want you to think about what you're saying, because only God is good. So we're not perfect. We're not even what the Bible would consider good. But God calls us to be blameless. Now, we know from our study in 1 John, if we claim to have no sin, we are liars and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us. The pattern of our life is to walk in the light, to be blameless. Not saying we won't mess up, not saying we won't make mistakes, not even saying that we won't intentionally choose to not follow God's will at some point in our walk with him. But the pattern of our life should be blameless. When people look at us, there should be a difference. The greatest detriment to our witness as the church is when we look just like everyone else. If following Jesus does not change something about the way we live, we need to look and see if we are truly following him. Because I can promise you, when you encounter someone as powerful as Jesus and the transformation power of the gospel and the Spirit lives inside of you, it can't do nothing. It has to do something. It won't change you overnight and make you into this absolutely perfect being, but it will transform you. It always does. And if it hasn't, if the pattern of your life is walking in darkness rather than walking in light, John tells us it might be time to examine ourselves to see if we are still in the faith. Because when God calls us to himself, he calls us to live for his glory. And that looks different from the world, because the world pursues things. We pursue Jesus. So if he calls us to live for his glory, we will look different. Now, here's the thing. Unlike the Jews, we're not born into the covenant people of God. We're born again, which means we've all lived a little bit before we become the covenant people of God. In that way, we're a lot like these first people who entered into the covenant of circumcision, right? We've got something in our past, right? Even if you were saved as a child at 8 or 10, you've done something, right? And if you have kids, you're like, your parents will tell you you've done something that was not to the glory of God and to the glory of yourselves and pursuing your wants and not his desires. And so there is sin in all of our lives. Ephesians tells us that we are born dead in our trespasses and our sin. We must be born again to become the new covenant people of God. So listen, all of us have a past, but our identity is not found in our past. Look at Abram's name. My exalted Father looks back. Father of a multitude points forward. Our identity is not found in our past. Are there things that we have done, decisions that we have made that have marked our earthly life for the rest of our existence? Absolutely. I'm not saying that sin is without consequence. I'm saying that as the new covenant people of God, it does not define us. Our identity is not found in our past. Our identity is found in the God who made us and calls us to his purpose. Our identity is not, I was this person, I was that. Don't care. My biggest problem with the progressive movement within Christianity today, where homosexuals can identify as homosexuals and still be a part of the church, that's a problem, because you are putting your identity in your past. You're putting your identity in your sin. In Christ, that's not who we are. When you see those kinds of people come into the faith, in Corinthians, Paul says, such were some of you. Were. Past tense. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were saved by Jesus. And your identity is not found in your past. So listen, if you think the thing that defines you is the wrong thing you did yesterday or 10 years ago or 80 years ago, it's not. It's not. In Jesus, your identity is in Him. You identify with Him. And that outward reality is the inward reality. That outward symbol that we have, where we have died to our old self and been raised to new life. No, the water doesn't wash away your sin. The blood of Jesus did. Listen, when you come to Him, He changes you. Your identity is not your past. Your identity is Him. Him. Why did every single man in Abraham's household line up to have their foreskin removed? Because they were a part of the people of God, and their past did not define who they were. They saw a hope and a glory that was far beyond anything this world had to offer, and they saw it in Jesus. Do you see it? Because this world has nothing to offer you, and He has everything. Everything that you pile up in this world is straw and hay and stubble, and when the fire of judgment comes, it's gone. It disappears instantly. Burn it and see what happens. It's amazing. When you burn things, you know what stays? Things that it can endure fire. When we build our life on Jesus, when judgment day comes and fire rains down, what remains is what's built on Him. If you build your life on the identity of your past, you're building on wood and stubble and hay, and it will go up in smoke. If you build your identity on the Jesus who died for your sin and was raised to life so that you could receive that victory too, in the end, you will stand. In the end, what is built on Jesus is all that will endure. You are made for Him. You are called according to His purpose. Your identity is His. When God looks at us on Judgment Day, do you know what He will see? It will not be us. It will be Jesus. He doesn't see our sin. He sees the price paid on the cross by His own Son. Our identity is found in Him and nothing else. Nothing else. God said further to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant and your descendants after you throughout their generations." Do you realize that your decision to follow God today brings blessing to future generations? Your decision to follow God and live in obedience to His word is a direct blessing to everyone who will come after you. Think about it. The decision to follow God and not the ways of this world, the long-term consequences of living the way the world wants you to live to satisfy yourself leaves you empty and desolate. If you follow God, if you follow His word, is it hard? You better believe it. But I've never found anything in this world that was worth pursuing that was easy. Your decision to follow God today will directly benefit your children and your grandchildren. The decision you make to follow God today echoes down the centuries. At my parents' house, because I'm absolutely terrified to have it in my house because it might mess up, but there is published in 1868, a Danish Bible, and it's about this tall, and it might be that big. Tiny little thing. It belonged to my great-great-grandfather who immigrated here in the early 1900s. I'm assuming since it has a publication date in the 60s that it was probably his father's. I don't know a whole lot about that side of the family because there's an interesting thing. When you get back into Scandinavian countries, everybody changes their last name. It's you're the son or daughter of whoever. And so it becomes a little difficult to track. So I'm not sure who the first person in my family line was to follow Jesus, but I can guarantee you it made a huge difference to everyone who came after them. Look around you. You know what one of the beautiful things about Calvert's Baptist Church is? Families. There are 3 and 4 generations of people that sit in these pews together. Why? Because somewhere down in your family line, somebody made the conscious decision to follow Jesus, and it has blessed you. Because most of you who have family that spans 3 or 4 generations in this church have grown up under the teaching of the gospel, who have heard the good news of Jesus from the nursery. Thank whoever it was who first decided in your family to follow Jesus. Because I guarantee you, it has made all the difference in your life. All the difference. One of the great privileges and also one of the great tragedies of my job is I get to do funerals. It's a great privilege because I get to honor saints who have run their race well, who have left a legacy of godliness and the gospel. Unfortunately, sometimes I also find those who have not left that legacy, and it is absolutely jarring to see the difference. The difference between those who have the hope of the gospel and those who mourn as if they have no hope. And that distinction is so evident in that moment. Trust me, your decision to obey God today is an absolute blessing to your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and your descendants for centuries to come. Don't dismiss the importance of simple, steady obedience to God's word. It doesn't look flashy. It never has. If I told you the names of my ancestors, you would, I don't even know who that is. And one, how do you pronounce that name? It doesn't matter if you know them, if they're great by history standards. What I know is the gospel has come down through the generations in my family. And I have the hope of Jesus because someone somewhere, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years ago, decided, I'm going to follow Jesus. It matters. You know how I know it matters? Because Genesis 17 has these guys line up to sign up for the covenant. And it's 4,000 years later, and you and I are still talking about their decision to follow God. Tell me it doesn't matter. When the seed that was promised to Abraham was the Son of God who saves you and me by his blood on the cross. The decision to follow God today matters. Do it. Do it. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Sarah would laugh, and God would get the last laugh. When they named him, he laughs. No matter how impossible it may seem, trust God's promise. Trust him. Trust his promise. It may look something ridiculous, like a 99-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having a newborn. It may look that ridiculous. Trust it. Trust it. Because that absolutely ridiculous promise is the reason we have Jesus. And you know what's wonderful about that? Despite all the ways that Abraham tried to derail it, God was faithful to his promise. Despite all the ways that Abraham tried to say, no, just do it my way, it'd be simpler. God said, no. Because when I keep my promise, it is a testimony to my faithfulness to 1,000 generations that will see my faithfulness in the absolutely hilarious birth of a newborn to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman. Because God always, always, always keeps his promise. always. Abraham says, what about Ishmael? Right? What about Ishmael? Why can't you just bless him? God said, I can and I will, but he's not the son of promise. Listen to me. This is a very important distinction for us to make because the church has not always made this distinction well. I'm going to make a statement. I want you to hear it. Every single child deserves to be celebrated no matter how they came into this world. Every single child is a blessing from God, made in his image to reflect his glory. Every single one that comes into this world, no matter how they got here or what happened to get them here, is a blessing from God. Every single one. Now, that being said, there are sinful ways to bring children into this world. That child there's nothing wrong with that child. You hear me? Hear me clear. There's not a thing wrong with that child. Beautiful and made in the image of God and deserves to be celebrated. But there are sinful ways that we bring children into this world. You're like, what are those? Simple. If it's not within the context of a marriage between a man and a woman, everything outside of that is a sinful way to bring a child into this world. There's a reason that the symbol of God's covenant was cutting off the foreskin. Why? To remind those people that there is a right way to live in covenant with God. And one of the crazy ways that we tend to break with God's covenant and God's command is in reproduction. Sexuality has become the defining thing for our culture. What element of your personality defines you? People in our culture define themselves by their sexuality. You realize that? There are 1,000 other ways to identify yourself. Right? You have a name, you have a job, there are 1,000 different categories that you align yourself with, but the one that our culture wants to highlight and deify, worship, is your sexuality. Newsflash, that's not new. Look at the pagan practices of every ancient religion from the time history began till the modern era. False idol worship almost always revolves around sexuality. It always does. Why? Because it is the easiest thing that God created for his glory and our good to be corrupted. Why? Because we have natural inclinations and urges that God has made us with that are for his glory and our good, but they're to be directed into the context that he has declared to be righteous, and everything else is off limits. And it's the easiest one for us to say, well, it's just natural. I know it's natural. God did not want you to be a slave to your impulses. God created you with a mind to govern those impulses so that you could push those impulses he created you with to bring honor and glory to him. Ishmael was a product of trying to circumvent God's will for Abram's life. Abram could have waited 14 more years to have Isaac and avoided a whole lot of issues in his household, but he did not. And so there is a complicating factor in the covenant promise of God. I'm going to make you into a great nation. Ishmael will get to enjoy some of the promises that are made to Abraham just because of his connection to him. Just because he has a connection to Abraham, he will receive blessing. But he will not receive the covenant. He'll receive the sign of the covenant, which you read about at the end of the chapter, but he will not receive the covenant. Why? Because that was not God's will. But, from our sin, God can still bring blessing. and does regularly. Because here's the thing, if God could not bring blessing from the midst of our sin, we would all be in trouble, wouldn't we? Because none of us are perfect. Some of us might qualify for blameless, but that still means there's something in our past. Isn't it a wonderful promise of God that he can bring blessing from our sin? Because he sinned with Hagar. He did. He went outside his covenant marriage to have a child. It doesn't matter that it was culturally appropriate for the day. It's wrong in the eyes of God. And on top of that, it was a way for him to circumvent God's promise and to help. We talked about that last week. But guess what? Ishmael will still receive blessing because God has made that promise and God keeps that promise. And even in the midst of our sin, God brings blessing. So at the end of the chapter, everybody lines up and everybody partakes in the covenant of circumcision. What do we learn from that? When God calls, obey. When God calls, obey his calling now. On the same day that he receives this instruction from God, every man in his household received the covenant of circumcision. Every single one. No delay, no questions. Nope, just God has said, this is the sign of our covenant. We have covenant with him. We're going to show it. Do you realize how vulnerable that made them? He's not living in a walled city. He does not live in a place that he can easily defend. He is a sojourner. He's a wanderer. He's a nomad. His security is in the fact that he can muster an army of 300 plus instantly from his house. And now every single one of those men is vulnerable. You'll actually see this vulnerability in a later story with Jacob and his sons, in which they enter into a contract with a neighboring city, and they say, oh, no, if you're going to be part of us and marry our sisters and all that good stuff, you're going to have to be circumcised. And so those guys were laid up sore for days. And you know what happened? 2 of Jacob's sons went in and killed them. Why? Because they couldn't defend themselves. Part of the covenant of circumcision makes you vulnerable to the things of this world. It was not a thing that they could just say, oh, well, this is okay. We'll just take it in order and there will always be somebody on guard. No, they believed God could take care of them. And rather than questioning the consequences of what obeying him would be, they just obeyed him and left the consequences to him. Even when it left them vulnerable, even when it was painful, they chose to obey God. So when God calls, the simplest thing for us to do is obey his calling. You're like, what if? But what about? Just do it and trust those consequences to him. Because where we get in trouble is when we delay our obedience to him. When we question what the consequences of obeying God will be. And we say, is it worth it? It's always worth it. Don't even ask the question. Just do it. Obey his calling. Why? Because when God changes your name, he defines who you are and how you live. So when he calls, you obey. That's it.